The house on Larkspur Lane. Rachael Whitmore heard the deadbolt slide home before she understood what it meant. She was standing on the porch of the only house she had ever lived in, her arms full of the things her mother had decided she was allowed to keep, and for a moment she just stood there listening to that small, definitive click. It was such an ordinary sound. She had heard it 1,000 times, usually from the other side, usually because she was the one locking up for the night, after her mother had already gone to bed. She had never once imagined hearing it aimed at her. The porch light was the same yellow bulb it had always been, buzzing faintly, drawing in a moth that kept batting itself against the glass. Rachael watched the moth for a second because it was easier than looking at the door. Then she picked up the 2 trash bags at her feet, the sum total of 26 years reduced to what would fit in kitchen-sized Glad bags, and walked down the steps she'd swept every Sunday since she was 9 years old. She didn't cry. Not yet. That would come later, in the car, in the dark, in the particular way grief arrives once it's finally safe to let it. To understand how she'd ended up on that porch with garbage bags instead of luggage, you'd have to go back further than that night. You'd have to go back to a girl who started bagging groceries at 16 because the store 3 towns over was the only place that would hire someone that young, and because her mother had made it clear, in the offhand way some mothers do, that if Rachael wanted spending money, she'd have to earn it herself. So she earned it. She earned it at the grocery store, and then at a diner where the manager let her pick up doubles whenever someone called out, and then later, once she'd aged into other kinds of jobs, she earned it in retail stockrooms and behind hotel front desks and anywhere else that would take an hourly employee willing to work weekends. She was not a girl who complained about work. She was a girl who simply did it, the way some people simply breathe, without making a production of it. And every month, without being asked twice, she handed some of that money over to her mother. For the electric bill, the water bill, whatever needed covering. She did this for 10 years. Not because anyone forced her to, no one held a gun to her head, but because that was simply what you did in a household where money was often tight and everyone was supposed to pitch in. She never thought of it as a debt she was owed back. She thought of it as being part of a family. What she kept for herself, she saved. Not out of some grand 5-year plan, not at first. In the beginning it was just instinct, a girl who didn't like the feeling of having nothing set aside, who'd grown up watching her mother stretch a paycheck thin enough to see daylight through it, and who decided, somewhere around 17, that she never wanted to feel that particular kind of scared again. So she skipped things. She wore the same 3 pairs of jeans in rotation for longer than she probably should have. She brought her lunch to work in a plastic container that had lost its lid years ago and now got sealed with a rubber band. She didn't go on the trips her co-workers took to the coast, didn't buy the concert tickets, didn't get her nails done or her hair highlighted or any of the small luxuries that made other 20-somethings feel like they were living instead of just working. Every spare dollar went into a savings account at the credit union downtown, and she made a habit of not checking the balance too often, because looking at it made her want to spend it, and not looking at it let it grow in peace, like something she'd planted and was letting alone so the roots could take. By the time she was 26, that account held more money than most people her age had ever seen in one place. She hadn't built it to buy anything specific. She'd built it because having it felt like the only form of safety she completely controlled. Her sister Melissa built her life differently. Melissa was younger by 4 years, and from the time she was old enough to notice such things, Rachael had understood, without anyone ever saying it outright, that she and Melissa were not held to quite the same standard. When Rachael missed curfew, there were consequences. When Melissa missed curfew, there were explanations made on her behalf before she'd even walked through the door. When Rachael brought home a B in a class she'd struggled in, her mother asked what happened. When Melissa brought home the same grade, her mother said the teacher probably just didn't like her. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of favoritism you could point to and win an argument about. It was quieter than that. 1,000 small tiltings of the scale, so gradual that by the time you noticed the imbalance, it had already been there for years. So, when Melissa got engaged and started planning a wedding with a guest list of 140 people and a venue that cost more than most people's first cars, nobody in the family was especially surprised that the budget quickly outran what Melissa and her fiancé could actually afford. And nobody was especially surprised either when their mother decided the gap needed to be filled by someone else. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening in October at the kitchen table where Rachael had done her math homework as a child and paid the household bills as an adult. Her mother had made tea, which should have been Rachael's first warning, because her mother only made tea when she wanted to soften you up before asking for something. "You've been saving all this time," her mother said, turning her mug slowly, on the table without drinking from it. "It's time you helped your sister the way she needs it." Rachael asked how much. Her mother told her a number, and for a second Rachael thought she'd misheard. It wasn't a generous gift. It wasn't even most of what she'd saved. It was very nearly all of it, 10 years of doubles and skipped vacations and rubber-banded lunch containers handed over so that Melissa could have a 4-tier cake and a string quartet and a photo booth with props. "No," Rachael said. It was the first time in her adult life she had said that word to her mother about anything that mattered. Her mother's face did something Rachael had never seen it do before. Not anger exactly, or not only anger, something closer to betrayal, as if Rachael's savings account had always belonged to the family in some unspoken way, and refusing to hand it over was less like declining a request and more like stealing something back. "I have given everything to this family," her mother said, her voice climbing. "And you can't do this one thing for your sister." "It's not one thing," Rachael said. "It's everything I have." "Then maybe," her mother said, and here her voice went cold in a way that frightened Rachael more than the yelling would have. "You don't need to be part of this family. Maybe you don't need to live under this roof either, if you're not going to act like you're in it." Rachael thought it was a bluff. People say things like that in arguments all the time and don't mean them. She'd said things she didn't mean herself, in the heat of an argument, and taken them back within the hour. She almost said something conciliatory, almost reached for some version of a middle ground, just to bring the temperature down. She never got the chance. Her mother stood up from the table, and something in the set of her shoulders told Rachael this wasn't posturing. Within the hour, Rachael's clothes were stuffed into trash bags on the front step. Within 2 hours, the locks had been changed. She found this out the hard way, turning her key in a lock that no longer recognized it, standing on the porch in the deepening dark, while the porch light buzzed overhead and a moth threw itself uselessly against the glass. That night, Rachael checked into the cheapest motel she could find off the interstate, the kind of place with a lit-up sign missing half its letters and a bedspread that had clearly seen better decades. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time before she let herself cry, and when she finally did, it wasn't loud. It was the quiet, exhausted kind of crying that comes after you've spent your whole life trying not to be a burden and have just been told plainly that none of it counted for anything. She looked up at the ceiling, the kind with the popcorn texture nobody uses anymore, and made herself a promise, the way people sometimes do in motel rooms at their lowest points. She was never going to let herself be treated like a wallet again. Whatever came next, it was going to be hers, completely, with no strings tying it back to anyone who could take it away from her on a Tuesday evening over tea. She didn't sleep much. Around 5 a.m, still in the dark, she opened her laptop and started looking at apartment listings, mostly out of habit. You lose your home, you look for another one. That's just the order of operations. But something about scrolling through identical one-bedrooms with the same beige carpet and the same landlord who wouldn't return your calls made her feel like she was about to trade one kind of powerlessness for another. A lease was still someone else's name on the deed. A landlord could still decide, on some Tuesday of his own, that he wanted you gone. So she changed her search. Instead of rentals, she looked at listings for sale, knowing full well, even as she did it, that it was probably a fantasy. She had savings, yes, but buying a house outright, with no mortgage hanging over her, and no cosigner, and no family to vouch for her, felt like something that happened to other people with more of a head start than she'd been given, and then she found it. It wasn't much to look at, even in the photographs, which is saying something, because listing photographs are engineered to make even a bad house look decent. This one didn't bother trying. The paint on the shutters had gone grey and was peeling in long curls. The porch sagged visibly on one side, like a shoulder shrugging. The yard hadn't seen a mower in what looked like a full season, weeds up past. The mailbox post and the mailbox itself was hanging by one screw. The listing described it, generously, as a fixer-upper with great bones, which in real estate language usually means nobody wants it and the bank wants it off their hands. Most people would have scrolled past. Rachael sat there at 5:30. In the morning, in a motel room that smelled like an air freshener trying too hard, and looked at that ugly little house for a long time. She didn't see the peeling paint, not really. She saw a foundation that the listing said was solid, a roof that had been replaced 8 years back, good bones under bad wallpaper. She saw a place nobody else wanted badly enough to fight her for it, which meant it might actually be within reach of what she had. Most of all, she saw a blank page. A house with no history in it yet, no memory of anyone else's rules, no name on the deed but the one she was about to put there. She called the listing agent before the sun was fully up. She bought the house that same week, for a price low enough that it barely dented the account she'd spent 10 years building. Standing in the empty living room the day the sale closed, holding a single key on a plain ring, Rachael felt something settle in her chest for the first time since the deadbolt had clicked behind her. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was closer. To relief. The specific relief of finally being somewhere no one could put her out of. What followed were months that blurred together into a single long stretch of sawdust and sore muscles. She kept her job, because the house didn't pay for itself. And every morning before her shift, she'd put in an hour of work on the place, stripping old wallpaper in the upstairs hallway, or scraping paint off the porch railing, or hauling out a truckload of yard debris before the sun got too hot to stand it. After work, she'd come home and do it again until it was too dark to see what she was doing. Weekends, which used to mean sleeping in and doing absolutely nothing, now meant 12-hour days with a paintbrush or a cork gun or a borrowed sander that screamed like something dying whenever she pushed it too fast. She learned things she'd never had reason to learn before. She learned how to patch a hole in drywall by watching the same video 4 times at midnight, pausing it every few seconds to check her work against the screen. She learned that the guy at the hardware store on 5th Street would give her the contractor discount on lumber if she just asked politely and didn't act like she was in a hurry. She learned which paint actually covered old water stains in one coat and which was lying to her on the label. She learned that her hands could do more than she'd ever asked them to, and that exhaustion feels entirely different when the thing wearing you out is something you're building for yourself, instead of something you're doing for someone else's approval. There were bad days. There was the afternoon she put her thumb under a hammer instead of a nail and sat on the porch step swearing at the sky for 10 straight minutes. There was the week the plumbing under the kitchen sink decided to fail spectacularly, and she stood ankle-deep in water at 11 at night, laughing in the particular unhinged way you laugh when a situation has gone so far past frustrating that it loops back around to funny. There were nights she fell asleep on a drop cloth because the couch hadn't been delivered yet and she was too tired to care. But slowly, room by room, the house began to change. The peeling shutters came down and new ones went up, painted a deep, quiet green. She picked out herself, standing in the paint aisle for 45 minutes, comparing swatches like the decision mattered more than almost anything else in her life. The sagging porch got new joists and new boards and a coat of paint, the colour of fresh cream, and it stopped shrugging and started standing up straight. The yard, cleared of its waist-high weeds, slowly filled back in with grass, and then with a few plants she put in herself. Nothing fancy, just some hostas along the front walk and a rosebush by the mailbox, because she'd always wanted a rosebush and had never had a yard of her own to put one in. People noticed. It's a small kind of town, the sort of place where everyone drives the same 3 or 4 streets to get anywhere, and the house on Larkspur Lane had been an eyesore for long enough that its slow transformation became something neighbours talked about over fences. Cars that used to speed past without a glance started slowing down. An older man 2 doors up, who Rachael had exchanged maybe a dozen words with in total, started giving her a nod and a thumbs up whenever he saw her out front with a paintbrush. A woman from down the block left a plate of banana bread on her new porch steps one afternoon with a note that just said, "Good work. Welcome to the street." By the time the last coat of paint had dried on the trim, the house that nobody had wanted badly enough to fix had become, without exaggeration, one of the prettiest homes on the block. Rachael stood at the end of the front walk one evening night, the last gold light before sunset, looking at what she'd made and let herself feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, proud. Not proud of a grade or a job title or anything anyone else had assigned a value to. Proud of something that was entirely, unambiguously hers, that she had built with nobody's help and nobody's money and nobody's permission. She had done it alone. She hadn't asked a single person for anything. It didn't take long for word to travel back to her mother and Melissa. Word travels fast in a town that size, and faster still when the story involves a daughter who was thrown out and somehow landed on her feet anyway. The kind of story people can't help repeating, half in admiration and half in disbelief. One afternoon in early spring, almost a year to the day since the locks had been changed on her childhood home, a car Rachael recognised pulled into her new driveway. She was on the porch at the time, coiling up a garden hose, and she watched her mother and Melissa climb out of it like this was any ordinary visit, like no time at all had passed and nothing unusual had happened between them. There was no apology in either of their faces. No hesitation even, the kind you'd expect from people showing up somewhere they hadn't been invited. Her mother's eyes moved over the house, the fresh paint, the porch that no longer sagged, the roses just starting to bud by the mailbox, with an expression Rachael had seen before, on other occasions, when her mother was doing arithmetic about what belonged to whom. "Well," her mother said, stepping up onto the porch without being asked, "this is really something. It's much too big for just one person, isn't it?" Rachael didn't answer right away. She finished coiling the hose, hung it on its hook by the door, and only then looked up. "It's exactly the right size for one person," she said, "because that's who lives here." Her mother waved a hand like Rachael had missed the point entirely. "We were just saying, in the car, it doesn't make sense for you to rattle around in all this space by yourself. We could move in, help you keep it up. It would be good for all of us, honestly, to be under one roof again." It wasn't phrased as a request. It came out the way decisions come out when someone has already made them somewhere else and is only now getting around to informing the people affected. Rachael understood in that moment that this was exactly the same instinct that had sent her mother across the kitchen table, asking for nearly everything she'd saved. The same assumption that whatever Rachael had built or earned was, in some unstated way, communal property that the family was entitled to draw from whenever it suited them. She didn't raise her voice. She'd promised herself, back in that motel room a year earlier, that she wasn't going to let herself be pulled back into old patterns, and she intended to keep that promise even now, with her mother and sister standing 3 feet away on a porch she'd built with her own hands. "No," she said again. The same word from a year before, steadier this time, because she'd had a whole year of practice saying it. "This isn't happening. This is my house. You're welcome to visit, but you're not moving in." Melissa opened her mouth like she wanted to argue, but Rachael was already holding the door open in a gesture that made her meaning unmistakable. Her mother's face did the same thing it had done that Tuesday evening over tea. That flash of something between anger and disbelief, as if Rachael's refusal was itself the offence, rather than anything that had come before it. They left without another word. Rachael closed the door behind them, and for a moment she stood with her back against it, breathing, before she went back to coiling the hose she'd already coiled. She should have known it wasn't over. People who believe something belongs to them rarely accept no the first time. They tend to treat refusal as an obstacle to be worked around rather than an answer to be respected. The next morning, before she'd even finished her coffee, Rachael heard the low rumble of an engine out front, followed by the particular grinding whine of a moving truck's liftgate. She looked through the front window and saw the truck already parked at an angle in her driveway, its ramp down, and her mother directing Melissa's fiancé as he wrestled a dresser toward the back of it. Except they were moving it out of the truck, not into it. They had come to move in, exactly as they'd announced the day before, as though Rachel's answer had simply evaporated overnight. She locked the door. It was already locked, in truth, but she checked it anyway, the way you check something twice when you don't quite trust that the first check held. They knocked first, a polite-sounding series of raps, almost cheerful, as if this were a friendly visit, rather than a second attempt at the same thing she'd already refused. When nothing happened, the knocking got harder. Then it became something closer to pounding, her mother's voice rising through the door, saying Rachel's name, saying this was ridiculous, saying family didn't lock each other out. Rachel stood in her kitchen and listened to it for a moment, feeling the old, familiar pull to open the door and smooth things over, the pull that had kept her handing over rent money for 10 years without complaint. Then she picked up her phone instead and called the police. She gave the dispatcher her address, explained calmly that 2 people were attempting to move belongings into her home without her consent, that she had already refused them the day before, and that they would not leave despite being told the house was not available to them. Her voice didn't shake. She was almost surprised by that herself. The officers who arrived were unhurried and businesslike, the way people are when a situation is more awkward than dangerous. They spoke to Rachel's mother and sister on the porch, and Rachael heard enough, through the closed door, to understand the shape of the conversation, that the house was owned outright, in Rachel's name and no one else's, purchased and paid for without so much as a co-signer, and that whatever family history existed between the parties didn't change who held the title. Her mother's protests grew louder for a moment and then, almost as quickly, deflated, the way an argument does once it becomes clear there's no legal ground left to stand on. Rachael watched from behind the curtain in her front window as the officers walked her mother and sister back to their car, past the moving truck that would now have to be driven away with the dresser still sitting half-loaded in its bed, and as the small procession pulled out of the driveway and disappeared down Larkspur Lane. She never found out where they went after that. Some part of her expected to feel the pull to ask, to check in, to make sure everyone landed somewhere safe, old habits reaching for her out of sheer muscle memory. But the pull never fully arrived. She realised, standing at that window with the curtain still in her hand, that whatever happened to them next simply wasn't her responsibility to carry anymore. It hadn't been for a while. She'd just been the last one to notice. That evening, Rachael sat on her porch, the one she'd rebuilt board by board, the one that no longer sagged, and watched the light go gold and then rose and then dim over the rooftops of Larkspur Lane. The rosebush by the mailbox had put out its first real bloom that week, a small, defiant red against all that green. The house stood behind her, quiet and finished, and entirely hers. Every wall had been repainted, by her own hand. Every floorboard had been sanded by her own effort. There was no name on any deed but her own, no rules attached to those walls but the ones she chose to set for herself. She thought about the version of herself who had sat on the edge of a motel bed a year earlier, staring at a popcorn ceiling, promising that she would never again let herself be treated like a wallet. She thought that girl would be glad to see how this had turned out, glad, and maybe a little surprised at how much peace could come from something as unglamorous as scraped paint and patched drywall and 10 quiet years of money set aside, a little at a time. The wedding had come and gone without her. She heard second-hand that it had been beautiful, that the cake had been smaller than planned, and the guest list trimmed, that everyone had managed somehow the way people always manage when the thing they were counting on doesn't materialise. She felt no satisfaction in that exactly. She simply felt, for the first time in a long while, that it had nothing to do with her. What she felt instead, sitting on her porch as the evening cooled around her, was something steadier than happiness, something more like the quiet, settled certainty of a person who has finally stopped waiting for someone else's permission to be all right. The days of being used were over. And that, she thought, watching the last light fade behind the rooftops of the only street she now called home, was worth more than any wedding, any inheritance, any approval she used to spend her whole life chasing. The end.